Right now, he's the director of the Institut des Textes Manuscrits Modernes in Paris, and he works there on Nietzsche and digital humanities. He's going to talk today about Nietzsche digital editions. Paolo.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you very much for the organizer of this beautiful day. And do you hear me? Okay. So let's start from the beginning. I started to work on what we call today digital humanities for very practical reasons. I wanted to publish the catalog of Nietzsche's personal library, including a facsimile reproduction of all the books, and the genetic edition of Nietzsche's manuscript describing the way in which he wrote his works. The only way to achieve this publication was to use digital technology, of course. But this turned into a more general project called HyperNietzsche, which was presented for the first time during a conference in Pisa in 1996. The proceeding of the conference included a CD-ROM, which was very new at that time, with some hypertext prototypes. The huge technological innovation at that time, introduced by the version 2 of Netscape, were the frame navigation and the plugins, especially the Acrobat plugin I used to zoom on the images of the manuscripts. In 2000, HyperNietzsche was presented in a book, which was the first book of the Presse Universitaire de France sold in the bookshops and at the same time freely available online. The main question of the book was how to organize knowledge in the digital medium. And it was based on two ideas. The first idea, let's call it hypertext, was that using the digital medium, we could atomize the single scholarly contributions according to their type and reassemble it in a more coherent way. As you know, in the print culture, scholarly knowledge came under the form of well-defined formats shaped by the physical structure of the book: treatises, critical editions, journals, collected papers, catalogs, etc. The problem is that these formats stored in the same container heterogeneous kinds of information. For example, a critical edition contains in a single book several types of scholarly contributions: manuscript transcriptions, text editions, philological commentaries, critical commentaries, cross-references, biographical references, bibliographical references, introductive or critical essays, and so on. From a logical point of view, and even more from an information technology perspective, this way of collecting and mixing different types of scholarly contributions is not satisfying, because then it is difficult to query, assemble, and redeploy them according to different purposes. In theory, digital technology will allow users to collect and compare different edition or translation of the same text, or to read all the philological commentaries concerning a certain text, but excluding the philosophical ones, or to create a diagram showing all the cross-references concerning a certain text. But for this to be accomplished, the different kinds of scholarly contribution and their parts need to have been previously clearly distinguished. Otherwise, digital technologies cannot deploy all their possibilities, and the user is only allowed to search words, getting endless list of occurrences without being able to retrieve and compare the information it needs. My solution at that time was to dismiss the old formats. No more proceedings, no more editions, no more journal. If you think a moment, the concept of journal issue on the internet is pure nonsense. It is justified only in the print culture, in which you need to have a few articles before being able to distributing them in the form of a volume. But on the web, you don't need that. You don't need to wait. You can publish each article. So my solution was to dismiss the old formats and use a unique collaborative space structured according to the different kinds of primary and secondary sources. And I put this structure on the homepage of my first prototype, designed, as you see, at the end of last century. I call this an hypertext, and it was also an attempt to make this term more precise. The term hypertext has always been rather vague and fudgy concept. The atomization allowed what I called the dynamic contextualization, which is the form of a scholarly navigation in this hypertext. To explain this, think a moment to a scholar in a pre-digital times, there are still some of them, which is his navigation system. He did not navigate the library by following a list of hits, like the kind produced by Google. Scholarly knowledge is not structured like a list of, or like a tree, but rather like a graph. In mathematics, a graph indicates a set of objects connected by links. These links not only indicate the connection between two objects, but explain also the type of or reason for the connection. The traditional scholarly infrastructure has been useful because with a simple bibliographical reference at the bottom of a page, an author was able to refer in a very precise manner to a specific passage contained in another article or in a book. The structure of a set of documents connected by referencing footnotes, which indicate both a link and a reason for the link, can be formally described as a graph. Understanding this helps to dispel also a common misunderstanding that the difference between printed books and hypertext is that a book ensures sequential reading, whereas hypertext introduces non-sequential reading. And this was an old story. And nothing could be more false in the realm of scholarly research, because a key characteristic of scholarly reading is precisely that it is non-sequential. A classicist at work in the library is likely to have a dozen or more books open on the table and to jump from one to the other. He verifies, he looks for connections, he follows links made explicit through the venerable tradition of scholarly citation chaining. But which is the most important information he needs? It is to know who quoted a certain passage of a text, who commented it, who edited it, who translated it. These functions, and only these functions, I wanted to implement as a navigation system in my hypertext. I call it dynamic contextualization because in this system, when a user selects the manuscript page, for example, the system will immediately present all the transcriptions, editions, and translation available for that page, as well as all critical essays commenting this specific page. Thanks to this feature, when a user selects the critical essay, it will be automatically presented with a list of all the primary sources cited in the essay, a list of all the articles cited by the selected essay, and more importantly, a list of all the essays in which other authors cite the essay currently being viewed. Dynamic contextualization is a coherent and rigorous concept, but as it turned out, quite difficult to transpose in an intuitive and easily navigable interface. In the Hyper-Nietzsche website, designed in 2000, contextual information was displayed using a vertical bar on the left of the screen. While navigating the website, the contextualization sidebar presented the user with all the contributions related to the document in the form of a list of hyperlinks. It seems a simple, reasonable, and standard solution, if standard means the fact that a lot of websites were designed to use a left sidebar, and users were more and more familiar with it at that time. Nevertheless, users experienced difficulties with the navigation, and they were not even able to visualize the facsimile or the transcription of a Nietzsche manuscript using this kind of interface for the contextualization. We will speak about it in a minute, but now allow me a nostalgia moment to briefly show you a selection of nice features of the old Hyper-Nietzsche. In Hyper-Nietzsche, it was possible to define zone in manuscripts, also non-contiguous and overlapping zones, zoom and rotation of page and of zone. We could name this zone and connect them to the related transcription with different form of transcription because we created an encoding language called the Hyper-Nietzsche markup language, HNML, and then we call it more seriously genetic markup language. And this language was able to generate, to distinguish the different layers, the different version of the same text which are on the same page, because each layer of correction corresponds to a different version of a text. And you could generate from the encoding a linear transcription and a diplomatic transcription for each layer. And also you will be able to, the machine could compare these different versions and, like in this case, indicates with colors the differences between these different versions of the text on the same page. We experimented also some ultra-diplomatic transcriptions. Here you can see, for example, the difference between a linear transcription of this page, a diplomatic transcription, and an ultra-diplomatic transcription. And also we experimented with interactive transcriptions. It was a nice tool I can show you. It's a tool you cannot see that. Nope. Ah, very good. But you see in your screen? Strange. Just a moment. Perhaps you can see now. Now, not. Very good. I don't know why. Because we have a double screen, probably. Really?
No, yeah. It's that way.
Is that way, the other way?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Very good. So now I have to find my cursor. Okay. So you can work with a manuscript page with an interactive transcriptions, and when you cannot transcribe a word, you click on here, and you see the word. Simply. Just a little toy. But we experimented with different kind of these transcriptions. So interactive transcription. Another function, another useful function, was the genetic paths. For each textual unit, Hyper-Nietzsche automatically displays all other text units that are genetically related to it, being they in preparatory stages or further development. And the reader can follow the path, displaying the facsimile and the transcription of each step. For example, this is the first step of an aphorism written by Nietzsche, and you can see that the origin is only a word, which is a joke. And then Nietzsche developed, this was written in a notepad, then Nietzsche copied it in a notebook and expanded it to expand also the joke and explain the joke. And then you have the version written in the manuscript for printing, in the proofs, and finally the published version. And you could also print this path to study it calmly on your desk, and you have all the version, and you can analyze the genesis of this aphorism. From the paths established by scholars, Nietzsche's source was able to generate automatically a diagram that indicates graphically all the paths that pass through a given piece of material, whether it be an aphorism or a manuscript note or a whole notebook. For example, this is the genesis of this notebook called N41. And you can see this in that form, and you say, for example, that there are 65 notes which comes which come from the proof to the final version printed. Or you can also follow each path and in this expanded form. But in all these functions, the dynamic contextualization was suspended because it was a problem to have both functions, a coherent interface for these functions, and at the same time, the contextualization feature. And we introduced a series of new web pages called views, which didn't contain contextual information and made navigation easier and more perspicuous. Also, the home page changed accordingly, showing only the part of the websites contained some materials, because the problem of the other interface, other home page, was that it presented the structure, the general structure of the hypertext, but you couldn't know which parts of the structure were empty, ready to, of course, to welcome, to publish a new contribution, and which part were already filled by contribution. And you can see this is the version 0.5, and then the version 0.7, and then we experimented also other kind of homepage with a distinction between surfing knowledge and search information. You know, it was a time of Google, and people wanted to search for words. But finally, at the end of 2007, we decided to radically modify the interface and the conception of the website, and to mark this turning point, we changed the name of the project from Hyper Nietzsche to Nietzsche Source. We said that hypertext has been already vague, and now it sounds quite retro. Source, on the contrary, is more vintage than retro. It has also a technological meaning, called source, and a political one, open source. But it's true that the principal meaning refers to the knowledge in general and to the philological sources in particular. It suggests the concrete and documented nature of research, and it also indicates that in the web site bearing this name, we could find the essential primary and secondary source for anyone who wants to study the life and work of an author. But this is not the point. To understand why the Hyper-Nietzsche interface was not satisfying, let us try to consider the principles on which it was built. The difficulty here was probably not the design of the sidebar, but the organization of content. That is the general structure of knowledge that this design was expected to express. Transposing the logical structure of dynamic contextualization directly in the interfaces, abstracting from old forms of knowledge organizations like editions or journals, was not a good idea. In fact, the use, the manipulation, the construction of knowledge objects don't depend on logic, but on history. Scholars cannot work well if their materials are organized in conceptual structures which are too innovative, too different from the long-term scholarship's practice, with objects showing a certain layout and presenting a certain affordability. We finally came to the idea that without renouncing the novelty of the system, we were designing at the database level. The interface should support as much as possible the habits and the expectations of the scholars. The solution was to separate navigation from contextualization. The interface of a suitable scholarly information management system should thus be divided into two communicating parts. A part A, to browse and navigate easily in the documents, and a part B, to contextualize and compare them. at a certain time we call this simple mode and scholar mode, but to give you an idea. In the part A, the electronic medium should try to recreate the traditional formats of scholarly communication, improving them if possible, but without altering their form and usability. When browsing documents, the interface should be designed to use the common templates which make the navigation intuitive for those who have a normal practice of the web. Functions are reduced to a minimum, and contextualization is absent. This part is divided into different subparts corresponding to the traditional formats of scholarly communication. So I had to slow down the speediness of innovation. I went a step back and tried to realize something that scholars could immediately use in their everyday work according to this strategy. But I try to go speedier. Let's come to what is Nietzsche Source today. Today, Nietzsche Source is an academic publisher which publishes 2 scholarly editions, the facsimile edition of all Nietzsche papers and the electronic version of the standard critical edition of Nietzsche's work, and an international and multilingual journal of Nietzsche studies. Let's start with the facsimile edition. As you can see, the consultation is very simple. Readers are provided with high-resolution color facsimile, and they can freely browse and download all the material available. We have not only notebooks, but also the proof. And for example, you can see here the proofs of Ecce Homo, one of the last documents Nietzsche read in Turin. At present, 30,000 pages have been digitized, and about 9,000 have been published in Nietzsche Source. The facsimile editions relies on a digital classification system, providing each page with a unique and stable internet address. The identifiers used in the URL correspond to the standard abbreviations used by scholars, so that our edition can be easily quoted in academic research, on paper and online. You see the key 14, 1. Key 14 is the name that every Nietzsche scholar knows or should know for this manuscript, for this proof. And comma 1 means the first page. And in a footnote in an article, I can simply quote DFGA, which is the name of the edition, Digitale Facsimile Gesamtausgabe, and the siglum of this specific page. And that's it. Why we decided to publish a facsimile edition of Nietzsche's work? I'm sure that everybody here knows the famous Nietzsche's work entitled The Will to Power. Well, actually, The Will to Power is a fake. It's not a work written by Nietzsche. Nietzsche has abandoned the project to write a book with this title, and it was his sister who assembled and published it under this name, under his name. And because all the manuscripts were stored in the safe of the Nietzsche archives, nobody was allowed to verify. Publishing primary sources is a fundamental need for the humanities. Primary sources are really the base of our activities. Only in the 60s, the reference critical edition could publish a correct text based on the manuscript, which is in the meantime were available. And the second edition, published by Nietzsche Source, is the reference critical edition. As you know, the critical edition of Nietzsche works were established by 2 Italian scholars, Giorgio Colli and Mazzino Montinari, and it was published in Berlin by De Gruyter. The problem with this critical edition is that it contains a lot of errors. either typographical errors or real errors in the transcription of the manuscripts. This is not strange. Every edition contains errors. Most of them have been discovered and corrected, and the corrections are published in long lists in the commentary volume, the so-called critical apparatus. To give you an idea, pathetisch instead of synthetisch. It's not the same thing. Körper, the body, was transcribed as Küche, the kitchen. Willen, the wheel, as Wollen, the wool. There are about 7,000 errors of these kinds. Unfortunately, for editorial and commercial reasons, the text volume have not subsequently been updated. As a result, the text of the hardcover edition does not fully reflect the philological state of the art. Even prestigious British, American, and Spanish translations didn't consider this simple fact, and they reproduced those errors even in translation. The critical edition published by Nietzsche Swords provides the most correct version of Nietzsche's works because it integrates all the philological correction directly in the text. When you read on screen, all corrected passages are highlighted, and with a click of a mouse, readers can see the uncorrected passage contained in the print version. Sometimes digital editions are less accurate and less updated than printed edition. In this case, the contrary is true. As for the facsimile edition, a specific digital classification system provides each work, chapter, aphorism, or fragment with a unique and stable internet address. The identifiers correspond to the standard abbreviation established by the reference edition. In this way, our edition can be easily quoted in academic research. In a paper, you can quote IKGVB, WB1, and these correspond to the first paragraph of this work, Richard Wagner in Bayreuth. Of course, there is also the possibility to perform complex textual search of words and sentences. The third publication of Nietzsche Swords is Studia Nietzschiana, an international and multilingual journal, which is, of course, peer-reviewed, available for free, and which use URL as reference too. In internet, you cannot quote the page of an article, so we use paragraphs. If you want to quote a certain passage, Studia Nietzschiana will allow you to refer to a particular paragraph, just adding a comma followed by a paragraph number. Comma 7 means the 7th paragraph of this article. And so you can quote it again in your paper published in a printed version or on the web. If you want to quote a footnote, just put N before the footnote number, and you'll be able to address exactly this third footnote of the article. In addition to the 3 existing components, we plan to publish a general bibliography, the reproduction of Nietzsche library, finally, and a proper genetic edition. But this is not all, because an additional component is foreseen called contexta. Contexta in Latin means things which are connected, and this component is precisely about relationships among different types of content. It is an interlinking system which connects all the other Nietzsche Swords components each other. So, let's resume. In the part A, you have traditional formats of scholarly communication, the journal, the facsimile edition, the critical edition. In this part of Nietzsche's thoughts, as we said, the electronic medium recreates the traditional formats of scholarly communication, but from each page of part A, a link allows the user to switch to a corresponding page of part B, and vice versa. In part B, called contexta, all the documents which in part A appear organized in different formats are completely atomized. It's now possible to use a set of tools to retrieve them according to different criteria, and above all, to contextualize and compare them. Let me to show you an example starting from the facsimile edition. In each page of the facsimile edition will appear a contexta button, and clicking on this button will lead to a synoptic mask which connects the image contained in the facsimile edition with the related transcription contained in the critical edition. And the synoptic representation is widespread in erudite tradition, at least since the time of synoptic gospels, and scholars should therefore not be lost. With this mask, they will be able to compare not only different versions of a text, but any kind of contribution. Or they can have a three-part synoptic mask with commentaries coming from Studiosi, from the journal, which does not publish only articles, but also commentaries, sources, little philosophical, for example, commentary about the text. And, of course, you will be able to consult the articles commenting this page, but also the genetic paths related to this page, coming from the genetic edition. The same starting from the critical edition. In this case, you select a Nietzsche aphorism, and you will be able to consult all the articles commenting this aphorism of Nietzsche in this synoptic mask. On the left, you have the aphorism, and on the right, you have all the passages, the precise passages in which these articles published in Studiosi comment on this aphorism. As a result, these editions are widely used by scholars all over the world. More in Germany, of course, than in USA, in France, in Italy, in the UK, but as you see, almost all over the world. Last month, we had more than 6,000 readers. In the last year, about 1 million pages viewed. Since the opening in 2009, there was a constant progress. We doubled the number of readers. And from this diagram, you can also recognize that this website is a real academic website, because during summer, scholars work less and the hits fall down. As you see, there is also a constant. So this is really a normal tool used by Nietzsche scholars all over the world. So the subtitle of my books was Model of an Internet-based scholarly hypertext for humanities, philosophical question, legal framework, and computational tools. At that time, I thought about something like a Facebook or eBay for scholarship, not for chatting or buying, but for doing scholarship. And of course, Facebook was not yet born. So I thought in terms of a single software, a single model, which could have been able to concentrate all the scholarship. But I think that is not the way in which we can do it. We tried to do some part of it, for example, PhiloSource, in the framework of an European project, we built up this network of different corpora called PhiloSource. But the model to which I'm thinking is called now Scholar Source, the idea of unite different or to make interoperable different source project dedicated to single authors. But I have no time now to speak about this model. I described it in an article which is more joking, which is a conversation, a Skype conversation between a philosopher, an Oxford philosopher, who speaks like an Oxford philosopher, and a computer science of the Google generation who writes in terms of SMS or with the abbreviation. But they communicate nevertheless, and it was published in Chicago in this beautiful book with this beautiful title, Switching Codes, which is what we are doing all the time when we work on digital humanities. We switch codes between computer sciences and humanities. And this is the joking version, but there is also a serious and boring version I just published it's not yet published, I corrected the proofs, published in Florence by Leo Olsky on the scholarly use of the internet. So, but this is, as I said, this is another story, and if you want to read it, just drop me an email, I'll send you a copy of that. Thank you very much for your attention.
It was a bit long, but I cannot believe you made it between 79 slides. Well done. Congratulations. Are there any quick questions? We need to get to another speaker, but if you have a quick question now that cannot wait, please. Yes.
Thank you very much. I was really impressed, because it seems like a whole concept of the internet itself.
You know, I'm a philosopher, so it's a question of...
I think you mentioned at the beginning that this is also open for contribution. So how does the... Sorry. You mentioned at the beginning that this is also open for contribution. So how does the contributing part works? So is there a validation of what's published and what's transcribed? How does it work?
At the beginning, in Hyper Nietzsche, you could contribute with one line of transcription. So on each page, there was a button, send your own contribution, and you could send a contribution for one line, and then it was peer-reviewed and published eventually. With the use of traditional formats, now the contribution comes through studenti. Studenti is the journal. It's pure nonsense in electronic medium, of course, but traditional formats. And in studenti you can send your article or your commentary, can be one line of commentary, why not? I can show you the member of the, it's not very important, to the peer review system, and we have 14 specialists of Nietzsche coming from all over the world, at least two specialists for each language we use. We can publish in 6 languages, and they decide.
This means that everything is peer reviewed.
Yes.
So thank you.
Yes. And this is important because it is a scholarly website.
Okay. Another question is related with the scalability of the thing. So, because of the experience with our project, it takes a long time. You need a lot of effort. How do you think is this really all these approaches are really scalable, or we will need to develop automatic tools that will help you with this? Because in your case, you integrate a lot of information, right?
You
So
what?
You integrate a lot of information.
Yes,
so
of
you
course.
have a
Of
lot
course.
of information. And if it is basically human work, this is going to be a huge...
No, no.
Yeah, okay.
It was a very long discussion with our computer science, of course. So they calculate that the system of dynamic contextualization is actually exponential. So machine theoretically cannot afford it because there are too many links, etc., too many relations, etc. But in the fact, we use, at the end, we tried with different kind of database, including RDF native database and so on. But at the end, my solution was to use the most stable and old technologies, that is relational databases, MySQL, PHP, and nothing else. And to divide the publication side from the working side. We have a software, and some software for the back end, for improving the system, to contribute to the system, etc., etc. And then we have a pure, simple database only for the publication. And of course, this is scalable because you can construct a view or a table containing all the data pre-calculated for the website, for constructing the website and answer to the query. So you don't have the MySQL database has not to recalculate on the fly all the relationships when you make a query. But he has already that pre-calculated, stored in one simple table without relationships. The publication table.
But besides the scalability of the operational system, but when you create information, so when you just gather the information, where you create all these relations, is this basically human-based work, or do you use some kind of automatic tools that can infer things? Or?
Do you remember the genetic path?
Yes.
The genetic path has to be constructed by scholars, because this is a scholar contribution. It's scientific things. You have to know, you have to decide which node is the avant text or previous step of another node, or cannot be done by a machine. But then the machine can calculate the diagram, and this is automatic. Or the version, when you transcribe, to decide if this is the second layer of correction is really a new version, the machine cannot decide it. You have to decide and code it in the XML. But then the machine can calculate all the layers and can also calculate the differences.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think we should move to our next speaker. So let's thank Paolo again.